Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our November installment of the Montpelier Virtual Book Club. I'm delighted to be here this evening with my friend, Dr. Kelley Fanto Deetz, to talk about her wonderful book, Bound to the Fire: How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine. So I will introduce Kelley, and then she will give a sort of a talk for a while. Then we'll sort of have a conversation, and we at all points welcome your questions in the Q&A. So here we go. Dr. Kelley Fanto Deetz is the Director of Programming, Education, and Visitor Engagement at Stratford Hall, home of many generations of the Lee family on Virginia's Northern Neck. She holds a BA in Africana Studies and History from the College of William and Mary, an MA in African American Studies, and PhD in African Diaspora Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. She was a professional cook before becoming an academic. She specializes in early African diaspora culture and archaeology, slavery, visual and material culture, and public history. Dr. Deetz has worked as a consultant for several museum sites throughout the Mid-Atlantic and partnered with National Geographic to work on projects related to Nat Turner. Her work is highlighted in National Geographic's documentary film, Rise Up: The Legacy of Nat Turner. She is taught at UC Berkeley, Randolph College, Roanoke College, University of Lynchburg, and the University of Virginia. Her book, Bound to the Fire: How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine, was named as one of the top 10 books on food in 2017 by Smithsonian Magazine. What I really love about the book is the way that she use methods and evidence from a variety of different disciplines like archaeology, architectural history, oral history, documentary sources, recipes, and even your own knowledge of the culinary arts to tease out the lives of the enslaved cooks from the white world that they inhabited. And I think what you do such a brilliant job of showing us is the extraordinary skill, strength, resilience on the part of the enslaved cooks, many of them women, to withstand extreme working conditions and meet stratospheric expectations within a system that was denying their basic humanity. So this is a great book, and I, without further ado, hand it over to Kelley Fanto Deetz.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth, for having me. Thank you, Montpelier. Thank you to all of you who are Zooming in tonight. It is always an honor to talk about the stories of these enslaved cooks, to talk about the work, to introduce you to my dear friend and historical interpreter, Dontavius Williams, who's here behind me. He and I work a lot together at Stratford Hall. He has now become our go-to, amongst others, to do a lot of the African American foodways demonstrations, and he is one of my dearest friends, and I love to give him props whenever I can. So if you're looking for a phenomenal, engaging, passionate interpreter that does cooking, call him up. He's also a really good cook, so you get to eat his food as well. So I'm going to start out tonight with about a 25-30-minute talk. I got some slides. I'm going off script of what I normally do because I want to leave a lot of time for conversation. So I want to talk for a minute about why I do what I do. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if you don't mind. And then I can, see here, show you some slides and walk us through all of this. Here we go. I think I'd be a pro. I've been doing all these Zoom talks here lately. All right. Okay. So my book is called Bound to the Fire: How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine. And this book is not about food. And that's something that I think is a lot of times misunderstood. A lot of people come to my talks thinking they're going to hear all about puddings and pies. And, you know, absolutely, we're talking about food, but we're talking about who actually did the cooking and where this food came from, both in skill and in labor, and the legacy of that history. So this book is really part of a large larger movement of culinary justice. It's a phrase coined by Michael Twitty, who's also a friend of mine, and really sort of recalibrating the ways in which we think about American food, and including the stories and the contributions of people who have been long left out of that narrative. And that's one of the main sort of thrusts of my book, is to rewrite that history in a way that gives proper credit, right? Adequate credit to the people who actually cooked this food and made American food what it is. This book is also an attempt to get people thinking about how memory and interpretation really affect the ways in which we think about institutional slavery, the legacy of slavery. Who is Aunt Jemima? Who was Aunt Jemima? How are we dealing with her now in 2020, very differently than we were dealing with her even in 2019? How has her sort of history and legacy evolved over time, and what does she stand for? How can we use her story and others like her to sort of elevate the stories of these enslaved chefs and then give them proper credit? And then lastly, how do you interpret these kitchen spaces at these historic sites? Most plantation museums have a standing kitchen still, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to go ahead and get started here. So a lot of what I do in the book, and I do when I give talks on this topic, is I try to tether the romance of food. Again, people come to this talk, they buy my book because they want to read about food. I tether that sort of lore of food with the pain and reality of enslavement. So you cannot have that pie on that table at the Lee's plantation without the forced labor of the enslaved chef who made it. So being able to really balance those two narratives, balance those two worlds in a way that brings integrity to that story is really important. Now, myths of the plantation kitchen. This is one of the things that I love bumping up against. When you think about plantation kitchens and you haven't done adequate research, which most people have not, people have this idea of this sort of happy slave, right? This sort of house slave, and I'm using that in quotes. This picture here is from Berkeley Plantation. God bless them. They have this hanging up in their museum, and it depicts this very romanticized idea about this 19th century kitchen space, right? You see this white lady, the mistress, she is cooking that food with the help of three very, pleasant and happy looking enslaved women who are just assisting her in her culinary fare. This picture is really sort of the essence. It is not a 19th century portrait. It was painted sometime in the Jim Crow era, and I'll talk about that era in a little bit and what that did to our collective memory and idea about this period and these histories. But this is really distills the idea that most people have of these enslaved cooks. When you think about Aunt Jemima, when you think about these plantation kitchens and the tours that you've been on at these plantation homes, you will get this narrative of the mistress cooking that food and maybe some help from the people around. So the myths of the plantation kitchen is the mistress, made all the food, and that the enslaved cooks who were supporting that mistress, right, were very happy and comfortable in their position. Now, juxtaposed to that image, you have another sort of morphing of this narrative. And you see this in everything from Aunt Jemima iconography, which I think has been the most powerful propaganda campaign, and one of the most powerful in the history of this country. You see it in Aunt Jemima, and you see it in what's called Black Americana. And I'm sure most of you have seen this in antique stores. Most of you probably have, not most of you, but many of you probably even own some. Whenever I give this talk, which is probably about once a month or more sometimes, somebody reaches out and says, I have this really embarrassing salt and pepper shaker. I don't want it in my house. Do you want it? So I have this like grossly large hidden collection of all this really racist iconography that was used during the 19th century into the 20th century to really promote the idea of the happy slave cook. Right? The happy person in that kitchen, they are there. I mean, right here is the 1940s ad, how Aunt Jemima makes another couple happy. So it is all about this Black servitude in that kitchen space, feeding, mothering, right? That mammy figure. You also see a heightened rise and these sort of ceramic, like these are, of course, spice jars. You see a rise in these cookie jars and those kinds of things as well that are meant to be placed in the kitchen. And these were very popular when enslavement ended, and you started seeing sort of the iconography of Aunt Jemima and the happy slave really sort of kick up in these advertisements. But really in the early part of the 20th century, when Jim Crow is really taking hold, you see a rise in this kind of material as a way to physically, right, with these pieces of material culture, keep African Americans in their place, right? You're in the kitchen, you're smiling, and life is going to be good. That is the mentality of a lot of the people who consumed these objects and the people who continue to look for things like Aunt Jemima, who's now not, she's discontinued, I understand that, but Rastus from Cream of Wheat, of course, there's Uncle Ben, but this whole notion of African descendant people being there to serve whites is something that has been built into the fabric of our country. Speaking of building into fabric of our country, I'm going to talk a little bit here about race in the built environment. So we're going to start big, we're going to go small. So when you think about a plantation, and I know Montpelier has a particular kind of landscape that I'm excited to learn more about. I've been there several times. I mean, there's a bunch of kitchens there, and now it's a different space, but you've definitely got some very exceptional stories to tell there. I know that for sure. But during so I'll back up a little bit. My book really focuses on larger plantations. So plantations that were large enough to have, an external building as a kitchen. They were large enough to have a distinct role as an enslaved cook. So not one that would be sort of where I live in Lynchburg or sort of, in the Piedmont, if you will, with exception of a few places that had more small farms where you would have had an enslaved cook and laundress be that same person. So I really focused on the larger plantations that were doing the kind of entertaining that was attracting people from all over the world. So these plantations were creating what became American cuisine in those spaces because they had the platform to do it. Now, these plantation kitchens are often if this was like a normal sort of classroom, or if I was in space with you and it wasn't on Zoom, I would ask you, what are the stories that you've heard about the kitchen being moved outside? And every time someone says, oh, it's because of the fire, or, oh, it's because of the smell, I'm going to talk about those two things and I'm going to problematize them. So this kitchen right here, this is Stratford Hall where I work. It's built in 1738. Now, by 1738, pretty much enslaved Africans, right, captured and then enslaved Africans, because they weren't enslaved when they were in West Africa. So captured enslaved Africans who were then forced to come to labor in Virginia and the rest of the colony and the diaspora. That labor would have been really heavily replacing that of indentured white servants that were really popular more in the early 1600s. So when you have the influx and the rise of enslaved Africans coming into the colony, you have an influx and rise of these white ladies coming into the colony. These plantation homes are being built to really set roots in this nation, to birth America and to become a colony that is successful and that has manor homes just like Stratford, just like they did back in the old country. So this is Stratford Hall, built in 1738. On the right here, you see a building that is the kitchen laundry. Now the kitchen was built outside purposely, and there's a warming kitchen in there. The kitchen was built outside, not because of fear of fire, but just that same relationship that I talked about a second ago, where you've got the influx and the rise of enslaved Africans coming into the colony in the late 1600s. You start seeing these large manor homes take those kitchens and putting them outside. So what was once a manor home or a house that had a plantation house that had a kitchen within it, once the enslaved laborer really started to replace the white labor that was in the house, you see a division of that landscape. It was a way that ideas about race and white supremacy started to literally build themselves into the landscape. So the idea of the kitchens being moved outside is not necessarily because of fire or smell, it's because of that. And I'll also challenge those two things. This is Stratford Hall. It has 16 fireplaces on the inside of it, and it has 8 chimneys. In the wintertime, you're going to have most of those fireplaces cranking at full heat with the labor of enslaved folks having to haul that wood in there and keep those fires lit. You're going to have a series of steps you're going to have to run up and down to put the fire out if it lit on fire. So you cannot tell me that those tiny little fireplaces with all the fabric around, those bedrooms was somehow less of a fire hazard than that kitchen with the huge hearth and with the enslaved chef who had cast iron and no curtains anywhere to be seen. The second thing I like to push back on this whole sort of myth of these kitchens being moved outside because of smell is think about what the kitchen would have smelled like, right? You would have had, some funky smells. Kitchens can stink. I worked in kitchens for years. I understand that there is that part of food production that is dirty and gross, but you think about the smells of a roasted duck. You think about the smell of gumbo coming out of that kitchen, of pies being baked. And then you go into the house and say, Mr. Lee might be in there and he might not have taken a bath for 7 months. And so really just sort of thinking about the smells, this is gross, but the smells of the 18th century were ripe. We did not have deodorant back then. People were using things like, lavender and oils to keep themselves smelling fresh, when we know for a fact right now that would not have smelled very well, especially compared to those pies baking in the kitchen. So the first thing I like to do when I give this talk is really sort of take the footing off this idea that these kitchens are somehow apolitical, that these kitchens somehow are not spaces of power and places where the idea of race was really played out during the early colony and into the 19th century. This is the comment that people lean on for that sort of myth. It's from 1705. It says all the drudgeries of cookery, washing dairies, etc., are performed in offices detached from their dwelling houses, which by this means are kept more cool and sweet. Again, we just talked about that. This is a great idea, and I'm sure some places did rely on this, but when you really start thinking about it, I think race plays a bigger role in that narrative. A couple of other things in the built environment that I want to discuss before we start talking about the labor and the food and the enslaved chefs themselves are things that you see that are literally also built. So this right here is a dumbwaiter. Thomas Jefferson, of course, he went to France. He fell in love with a lot of things over there. He fell in love with the food and the culture, and he fell in love with these dumbwaiters, and he was able to bring them back and have them at Monticello. Now, if you think for a moment about what a dining room scene would have looked like at Monticello, at Montpelier, at any of these places that we've all been to, if you would go back into a time capsule, you would have a room with white folks, elite folks sitting around that table, and you would have several, enslaved butlers or waiters standing around there to wait on these important guests. And their job was to not be seen, but to be there in case anybody needed anything, right? Think about what it would have been like to talk about anything from the Haitian Revolution to even as late as Nat Turner, 1831, talking about these different slave revolts, these risings that were happening, this unhappiness that was going on and pushback that was going on within the enslaved communities throughout the diaspora, talking about those issues in front of people that are held in bondage, standing right there. How do you talk, and how did any of the founding fathers talk about Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, in the company of enslaved people? How do you have those conversations in those dinner tables, in those dining rooms, at those dinner tables, when there are people standing around? So you have this thing called a dumb waiter. And if you think about it for 1 second, again, pull back, it's a dumb waiter. You can take an enslaved person, remove them from that space. You can have all of your courses laid out right on that dumb waiter and not have to risk the ideas of freedom and liberty leaking in, and in ways that they didn't want to happen into the enslaved community. So you see this sort of shift, and it's a way to flex. Of course, depending on the guest, you might not or may not be talking about these issues. Similarly, you have these, of course, this is the dumbwaiter that brings the wine out of the basement at Monticello. Everybody's seen that. Another thing that you see that's really fascinating are these underground passageways that were built. So these really started being popular around the Revolutionary War period, So again, you have this, before the Revolution, there was really, an understanding that, enslavement was very much part of our fabric, and there was a lot of pushback and conversations and talking about the moral fiber, et cetera, the immoral fiber, rather. But when you have the revolution happening and you have this moment where Americans are trying to figure out exactly who they're going to be, you start seeing these passageways be built. Now, some of them are underground, some of them, and they're called all-weather passageways. Some of them are built in the Palladian style. They're built beautifully, like Jefferson has these. He had one at Poplar Forest, and you see them throughout the South where they're these literal colonnades that go between the house and the kitchen. These acted as ways, just like the dumbwaiter, to mask the sort of hustle and bustle, and Stratford had one as well, of the enslaved labor going back and forth. Again, if it's 1819 and you're traveling to Monticello, you're going to know that Thomas Jefferson is a slave owner. That's just something that everybody knew. But there was a way to use these physical sort of manifestations to mask a little bit, right? And you go to these plantations and they'll say things like they did at Berkeley. I hope they stop doing this. But they talk about how it was an all-weather passageway and how they built these things to keep the rain off of the enslaved community. And that's just completely absurd if you think about it again for 1 second. Now, before I go to the next slide, I want to talk for a moment about this Whistling Walk underground passage. This right here was at Berkeley. They also had a passageway that went from the outdoor kitchen into the main house. And they used to tell the story about how they would make the enslaved waiters or cook, if it was bringing the food in, whistle while they walked into the house. And that always bothered me. I was 17 years old when I visited that plantation first. I didn't know anything about enslavement. And I found myself wondering if that could even be true. It just made no sense to me. Having worked in restaurants, knowing that you're literally elbow deep in biscuits when you're cooking, why on earth would it be important that that person didn't taste that food as if they hadn't tasted it in the kitchen? And what I realized is this sign right here, just like that image at Berkeley Plantation, that painting, these are Jim Crow era signs, Jim Crow era narratives, Jim Crow era paintings that were used to reinforce the Jim Crow idea that people needed to be kept separate. When in reality, during the period of enslavement, you had enslaved women nursing, white children. You had them literally sleeping at the foot of the enslaver's bed. And so you can't, thinking about that spatial relationship. And then how do you then reckon with Jim Crow, right? You put up these weird narratives about the separation that was actually never part of the narrative. Now, Southern hospitality. I'm sure all of you have seen these pineapples everywhere. Southern hospitality is one of, I would say, the most important characteristics of the South. And I grew up in California, so, I am not a Southerner, but I've now spent almost half my life in the state of Virginia, and I'm feeling, I'm not Southern. I do have Southern roots, though. But I've understood very much that the Southern hospitality is really that fabric that glues together the pride in the South, among other things, right? These pineapples are everywhere because they were, during the colonial era, the most rare fruit you could get, right? So I always tell people these symbols of hospitality are pineapples because, imagine a ship, going and stealing West Africans from West Africa, coming, to the Caribbean, picking up some rum, right? That was also made by West Africans who were enslaved there, West African recipe, bringing those casks of rum and a couple of pineapples up to Virginia. If that pineapple somehow didn't rot on that trip and it made it, say, to Stratford or to Montpelier, and you had one pineapple and you served that pineapple at your dinner table, you were the most hospitable, wonderful host ever. And this is important because Southern hospitality is the essence of Southern American identity. And Southern hospitality would not have been possible without the not only labor of enslaved laborers working in Barbados, working on the ships, working in Virginia, working everywhere else in the field, but particularly the ones cooking the food inside of these plantation homes. And when I say cooking the food, I am talking about throwing down, right? So these enslaved cooks that worked inside of the house at these larger plantations, they did not they did not just throw together some stuff and put it on the table. They were cooking several courses for guests. They were feeding the white folks everything from, just absolutely beautiful French-inspired soups to jellies to jams to pies. Each course, like you see here, might have anywhere from 5 to 9 things on the table at once. And you would typically have 3 courses if you sat down for a proper supper. So think about the amount of work that would go into having to make all of those dishes for that table, executed at the right time. Don't forget, these people were enslaved and they could not burn the biscuits. They could not mess the food up because that power dynamic was very much a part of the fear that they had to deal with every day. Yet they produced this food and they produced, dishes that really made Virginia known for not just hospitality, but for its cuisine. In addition to the Southern hospitality, sort of thread that we're talking about here, you would have sort of after dinner was over, the men would go then retire into the parlor and talk politics. And it was in these spaces that ideas of America were born, ideas of revolution, ideas of everything, right? These are so many of the things that America is proud of, right? We're born in these parlors with these men that were talking about the ideals of, our democracy, the Constitution, all of the things that we hold near and dear were done in these private spaces with these elite men. In these spaces, these men would be smoking tobacco, again, grown and cultivated and shipped by the forced labor of enslaved men and women, everything from their rum that they're drinking to the wine to the brandy. So these men, even in this particular space, this is not dinner time. This is after hours. This is smoking. This is drinking, doing really important sort of political sort of networking. They were literally consuming the literal fruits of enslaved labor. So I'm going to talk a little bit here now about the enslaved cooks. What was their life like? Bound to the fire, the phrase itself came actually it was almost 10 years ago. This was my dissertation at UC Berkeley, and I turned it into my book. But I was giving a talk, and one of my former students, Edwina, she said, "Oh, they were bound to the fire, Dr. Deetz." And I was like, bam, there's the title of my book. Because if you think about it, they literally had to spend the majority of their hours every single day in that kitchen. So, if they were making a multiple course dinner, like I showed you earlier, they would have to start way before sunrise. If they're feeding the Lees, which had, they were feeding people from all over the world. But if you were just even at Stratford Hall Plantation here, which is, we have Mr. Payne right here, who was the cook there for a while after enslavement, and who was born an enslaved man or child at Stratford Hall. Now on the right here, we've got Miss Martha Newman, who does some interpretation these days, although she's, pretty much near retirement and does mostly docent work right now. But you would have to cook all of those meals, and Stratford has one of the nicest kitchens, I would say, out there on the floor of a hearth like this. So you would literally, and for those of you on here, I'm sure there's some that are hearth cooks, you know exactly how this works. But for those of you that have not had the pleasure, I guess, of cooking on one of these, hearths, I don't think it's pleasurable at all. But I've learned to like what Dontavius cooks, I'll eat it anytime. So it works out pretty well. But you would literally make little fires all over the hearth floor, and that's basically your stovetop. And so all of these pots would then go on those little fires, and then you have this big crane here with a big pot that would be for a stew or something like that. These enslaved cooks had to work literally probably 16 to 20 hours a day sometimes. And if you think about how important it was to put on a meal for some of the most important people in the world, the Lees were entertaining representatives from everywhere, all over Europe, and similarly at Montpelier, anywhere else, the dinner table was set from the food that came from this kitchen and from the labor that existed in here. So enslaved cooks would die from being burned more than anything else. There's also a lot of oral history that says that to test, because they didn't have proper thermometers back then, if you're baking biscuits and you're baking bread all day long for breakfast and for lunch and then, or for dinner, as they called it, and supper, you would have to, use the bread oven, which is literally just a hole in the wall, and it's brick lined, and you would have to reach your hand in there. And when your hair's burnt a little bit, that's when the oven was hot enough to bake bread. So if you're making bread every day, imagine the long-term scarring that you would get from that. So again, the labor was intense and incredibly exhausting. Talk for a minute here about the food. A little bit ago, I just sort of showed you a dining room table that had a bunch of, sort of European inspired food. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk about the African food that made its way onto these tables as well and into American cuisine. But you see up here on the left, and I have not had dinner, and that looks really good to me. Not necessarily the pig head, but that oyster bisque looks fantastic. Oyster stew was something that I think Virginians probably ate their weight worth easily monthly. Similarly, hogs. So pork and oysters were, that was what Virginians were eating. The elite Virginians were eating during this period. Oysters if you were near the water, and of course more pigs and other things if you go inland. But for instance, think about the labor, and this is where I used my background as a chef to go into the archives. So I looked at everything, like Elizabeth said, everything from the regular sort of archival stuff that historians go look at, the plantation papers, the probates, the wills, etc., the letters, the diaries, all of those things rendered a particular kind of information. But I wanted to get more. So I do what is called reading against the archive, or reading against the grain. And it is something that is instilled in you when you're trained in African American history, especially the early part, because you can't just rely on what James Madison wrote in his book, or Dolly, about the enslaved community. You have to really sort of figure out ways to get their stories rendered without the sort of benefit, honestly, of having them be able to write down their own story. And so one of the things that I did was I went through menus, and I went through recipe books that were handwritten at the Virginia Foundation, not Foundation, I mean, it's the Virginia, what is it called now? Museum of History and Culture. It used to be the regular historical society. So they changed their name on me, so I get that mixed up. But places like that, small special collections at UVA, the William and Mary Archive. And I went there and I read all these really phenomenal cookbooks that were handwritten by these mistresses, and you would see things. And I approached it like I would if I got a cookbook from my grandmother, right? Which pages were the dirtiest, right? So that recipe was probably used more than the one that has never been opened. Which one had, extra sort of subtext on it? And moreover, reading the recipes. As a former chef, as someone who routinely cooks for big, parties of people, when you see a menu and your heart sinks and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I could never make this by myself in the amount of time that I'm allotting, it really gives you a sense of the amount of labor that went into these dishes. So for instance, one of the, say, 16 dishes that you might have to prepare if you were an enslaved chef for someone like the Madisons or the Lees, maybe one of those dishes was an oyster bisque. The recipe calls for 100 oysters cleaned and shucked. Now, anyone that has shucked one oyster knows what a pain in the behind that is. And you can imagine, I don't think the tool has changed much since back then, but having to clean the oysters, having to get the oysters, having to make sure there's no grit in them, because again, you have to cook a certain caliber because you still run the risk of being punished and abused by the person who's enslaving you. So you have to make a roux on an open fire, which is incredibly hard. So imagine just that one dish out of what I said, 16 dishes, incredible amount of work. One of the things that I saw in these cookbooks as well that I think was fascinating was the earlier cookbooks, and there weren't that many, but the 18th century cookbooks were pretty much, just sort of recipes that were children of Europe. So a bunch of British stuff, you might get a random German dish in there, but really Eurocentric. By the time the 19th century comes along, these cookbooks start, you start reading in these cookbooks that, again, were handwritten by the white mistresses. You start reading things like okra stew, gumbo, jambalaya, peanut soup. These are West African dishes that were literally brought over in the minds, right? These recipes brought over in the minds of the enslaved Africans and then translated with the ingredients that they had here at hand into these dishes, and that absolutely made their way onto these tables. And so my argument, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that they were absolutely eating them in the 18th century. But as anybody knows, you cook something, just, you get in the kitchen, you start throwing something around and you're like, okay, that was good, I'm going to write it down. So by the time the 19th century rolls around, you have got West African dishes being recorded in these American cookbooks as American food. So again, gumbo, that is just a straight descendant from a West African dish. Gumbo, of course, is okra, but that is a one-pot meal that you see throughout the South in different variants. Jambalaya is a descendant of jollof rice, which is all over West Africa, even today, and they have battles of whose jollof is better. And you see things like peanut soup. The peanut, came from West Africa into Virginia, and I can't think of anything more Virginian than a peanut. So it's the ways in which the labor and the food literally became the fabric of American cuisine in these plantation homes that were really defining what Americana food was. Before I get into another element, I just want to also talk for a moment about the social space of these kitchens. So this right here is a painting, and it's called A Kitchen Ball at White Sulphur Springs, Virginia. It was painted in 1838. Nobody knows exactly what's going on here. They say it might be a wedding. They're not really sure. But what I do know about this particular painting is that it is the visual manifestation of so many recollections that I've read, not only in slave narratives, but in the diary and letters of the white folks talking about even having weddings of enslaved people in the kitchen. So the kitchen acted as a, community center would, if you will, for the enslaved folks in the field. If they wanted to have a special ceremony, they would come up into that space. So this really pushes back, and a lot of the other things that I found out about poisoning, which I'll talk about in a second, really pushes back also against this whole idea of the folks in the house being somehow disconnected to the people, the folks in the field, or even their West African roots. There's this idea that the closer you get into that house, the more of an Uncle Tom you become, and the less connected to the people in the field that you are as time goes on. So these kitchens were really a landscape for everything from the labor, for cooking the food, and also for the field folks coming up into that space, and also the white folks coming down sometimes and watching. So it was really a cultural collision was happening in these spaces. One of the things that I found that I also I find incredibly fascinating and is really important in thinking about these enslaved cooks as more than just these sort of, quote, happy slaves, more than these sort of disconnected, whitewashed Uncle Tom types of people, is that in the archaeology, and this right here is Flower 200 Plantation Kitchen. It's a 19th century kitchen, early 19th century kitchen. It was the Wilcox family. Through archaeological surveys and through the collections that I've looked at in Maryland and Virginia, where hoodoo was very popularly practiced, and other West African derived religious practices, we have found a significant number of what are called caches buried in the bottom of the hearths. So caches would be a bundling of anything like personal objects, like a mojo bag. If you wanted to put a spell on somebody, if you wanted to conjure a certain deity, right, a West African deity, you would put certain objects in a little sack, or even just bury them in a certain place. This kind of ritual is seen, and we found it hidden in the evidence of these kitchens. And it's, you see them particularly in these kitchens in the northwest corner of these hearths, which correlates to all different kinds of West African diaspora religious practices, and also shows that these kitchens were not just a place where they might have been cooking the food or spreading, sort of gossip from the other plantation, or dealing with the stress and the abuse from the enslavers, but they were places of power where you could, put a spell on somebody, power where you could literally, sell tonics and things to the people in the community to really sort of take control, right, spiritually over that space. So again, it really sort of gives more nuance to these enslaved cooks than I think has been given to them before. One of the things that you see as well is the power to poison. And this is where I have an entire chapter on poisoning, sort of woven in with a couple of really important cooks that I talk about in here that really, I think, made an impact. But the power of poison is really, I think, an important one to discuss. So that threat of being poisoned was always there. And the one way you could poison your enslaver was through food. And so the cooks had a very unique power to hold over their enslavers, to threaten, right, their enslavers. And of course, there was, and I have in my book, a place where I stop and I just list the names of people who, enslaved cooks who were accused and executed because they were accused sorry, I'm having a little brain moment here. They were accused of poisoning their enslaver, and they ended up being killed because of it. Now, what's really sort of frustrating about all of that, one, it's a horrible thing that shouldn't have happened, but a lot of these enslaved chefs, there's no way to prove poisoning back then. There was no germ theory. These people could have literally, and I mean the white folks could have literally eaten some nasty milk and felt like somehow, the enslaved cook poisoned them. But it is in that dynamic, that possibility, right, of poisoning the enslaver, that some of these cooks had a little bit of power. So when you think about times like when Nat Turner revolted and other revolts happened, you see this sort of fear, spreading throughout the South, and these mistresses are writing to each other, terrified to eat the food. And so again, you had this moment, or these moments, where the enslaved chefs were able to hold a little bit of something, right? Unlike anybody else on the plantation, over their enslaver. And the back of those recipe books that I talked about a minute ago, the entire third of them are tonics. It's medicine. The difference between medicine and poison is dosage. You take one Motrin, you're just fine. Your headache's gone. You take a bottle and you're in the ER. So you can imagine the kinds of ways in which these enslaved cooks really had the ability to really send fear throughout the colony. I'm going to end with talking about these two particular images. And the funny thing is, we don't know who both of them are now. So the one on the right, this was supposedly Chef Hercules, George Washington's chef. It has now been proven not to be him, but for lack of having no image, I'm going to go ahead and just use this from here on out, because I think it's a very dignified portrait and I like to use it when I talk about him. I consider Hercules, Chef Hercules, to be the first celebrity chef in America. And I say that because he came up, working in the kitchen at Mount Vernon. He came and ended up going up to Philadelphia with George Washington when he was the president of the United States. He was then, trained for a little bit in that home and became the presidential chef and was there for 4 years. During that time, was a time when George Washington was a little stressed. He was stressed because when he moved there, he didn't realize, and this is kind of ridiculous, that Pennsylvania had a Gradual Emancipation Act. So anybody there who owned slaves, who kept them there for 6 months, those enslaved people were automatically freed. So he found this out quickly upon going up there, was really upset about it, wrote back and forth. And his way of dealing with that was to secretly take his enslaved domestic staff, including somebody like Oney Judge, down to Virginia to re-enslave them every 5 months and some change. So he was sending them back and forth. Hercules was cooking meals for heads of state for all over the world. He was going to market where he was meeting a significant number of members of the very large free Black community that was in Philadelphia at that time. He was meeting people in the docks. He was meeting a lot of really important people. Folks were coming to dinner at Washington's house and talking about how amazing his food was. He would sell his leftovers for hundreds of dollars a year out of the back door because they were that good. And what I love about his story, and I could go on forever about him, and I won't, because I have to talk about her in a moment. But what I love about his story is that two things. One is that there's the scene described by George Washington's step-grandson, and he describes Hercules as really, like, when I read it, it sounds like a modern-day Gordon Ramsay. I mean, he was just like in that kitchen, he ran it, like everything was done to perfection. Then he would leave his staff, if you will, right, to clean up. And he would put on his silk stockings and his velvet coat and his cocked hat and his cane and his watch, and he would strut down Market Street, and white men would bow to him. So if you don't think that that is America's first celebrity chef, I don't know who could be, right? And to go from that sort of status, right? Every 5 months and change, you're getting sent down probably a different way to Mount Vernon, to then at the end of your tenure, when Washington was getting ready to go back to, leave Philadelphia, go back to Mount Vernon, he sent Hercules back. He sent him back, and then Hercules was labeled recorded as shoveling manure a couple of months before Hercules ran away on George Washington's birthday. So happy birthday, George Washington. And my theory is that he probably met a lot of people that helped him escape because of what Washington was doing with his shenanigans of going back and forth. No one knows exactly what happens to him. There's different theories out there. Some say he's buried in New York State. Some say he ended up somewhere in Europe. Nobody really knows. And then on the left here is the cover of my book. This woman right here is just called the cook. We do not know her name, and I'm specifically saying that, and that she is not that she is nameless because she had a name, but she was recorded by David Hunter Strother in 1855 when he came down doing a piece for Harper's Weekly. And he came down to the South and he stopped at a little tavern, a little home in Amherst County, Virginia. And he was so struck by this woman's poise, her intelligence, and the power that she had over that household. He said that, her children get the first dips of all gravies, and that she has skill beyond words. I mean, he just waxed poetic about this woman, and he took the time to draw her, which I think is really significant. Now, she was not recorded here with a name, and I felt that it was important to have her on the cover of my book because she represents the countless enslaved African descendant women who do not have a chance to be on a cover of a book, who are not recorded in history, and whose stories are still yet to be told. So she is on my book to honor her and her legacy, because there are so many like her that were not famous like Hercules or not famous like James Hemings, who need to have their stories be told. And I'll end with this absolutely wonderful art piece by Betty Saar, 1972, from Berkeley, California, where I'm also from. It's called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. And I'll end my talk saying that I hope that my work and continual work that I hope to inspire, and people like my dear friend Dontavius inspires, will help liberate her narrative and prove to the world that not only were these men and women who were forced to cook for these plantation homes important to the building of this country, but they also helped invent American cuisine, and they were subversive actors in their oppression. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kelley.
You're welcome. Did I go over time? I hope not.
Well,
I get to talking and then I can't stop.
I encourage you all to put questions in the Q&A box. I'll go ahead and ask a couple of things. So Kelley, when I went back and reread your book to prepare for tonight, I found a really amazing sentence that I had underlined the last time. It's towards the back of the book. It says, "It is not the food that makes a cuisine. Rather, it is the cook that creates and sustains it." That's like how you are refocusing our understanding of the way the spaces like Montpelier, Monticello, Mount Vernon, Stratford Hall work is really critical. And especially for us at Montpelier, where we deal with Dolly Madison and, the kind of burden of Dolly Madison's hospitality, which, obviously.
I can't even imagine, right?
Dolly Madison was not cooking that food and polishing that silver and setting the table. And, she was didn't know how to make snow eggs or jellies or,
Right.
It's so incredibly important just to have this reminder at all times that Dolly Madison's reputation rested on the backs and incredible skills of enslaved women who worked long, hot days doing incredibly difficult work over
absolutely
fire in the summer in Virginia.
No, absolutely. I forgot about that sentence, so thank you for reminding me of it.
Yeah. So no one's put a question yet, so I'm just going to throw this out too. Some of you in the audience might have heard about this, but we have a really interesting situation in the area just adjacent to the main house at Montpelier, where we have carefully excavated and reconstructed 3 slave dwellings, 2 smokehouses, and then the final building that we're currently rebuilding right now, we figured out in doing the research and that, well, the archaeology and then the subsequent examination of the archaeology, that the building was way too sort of built in way too of an elite manner to have started off as an outbuilding. So by going back and looking at documentary sources and other things, we've realized that what it actually was the planter's cottage, a 1-room with a loft above, the typical kind of dwelling that planter families coming into the Piedmont from the Tidewater in the early decades of the 18th century would have had when they first got there. So it's the kind of house that James Madison Sr. grew up in at Mount Pleasant, and this is the house that he initially built when he married Nellie Conway in 1749. What we have now figured out, so Nellie Conway would have started off her married life there at age 18. It's got a huge hearth. And of course, enslaved cooks would have been in that tiny space with the family cooking. But then, 70 years later, Nellie's son, President James Madison, turned that house into a kitchen. So now Nellie is like 80 years old, and this has been converted into a kitchen for basically her household, where she had her own household, her own enslaved cooks and other domestic servants. And so
that's so fascinating.
The complicated story of this, to me, is really, really interesting. But anyway. So we have a question from Matt Reed.
Oh, Matt.
How has your research on kitchens and the enslaved community transformed the interpretation of Stratford Hall?
Oh man, I could talk about the interpretation and transformation there all night. So I've been there for 2.5 years, and I was first there 4 years ago, actually giving this talk, funny enough. And then I was a keynote for a couple of their events. And John Bacon, who's the outgoing president now, asked me to come and do some consulting there and sort of talk about, go on the tour and really give some feedback on how to deal with the narrative there. And, I did this at a lot of different plantation houses, and I did it there, and there was really an absence of any sort of mention of enslavement. And so I gave him some feedback, and then he ended up hiring me to do it as a full-time job. So one of the first things I did was I rerouted the tour. So when you go on these plantation tours, normally you start in, the big fancy parts of the house, and you're sort of like let to go sort of, explore the rest on your own. I turned that completely upside down. The tour now starts in the kitchen. The tour starts where we talk about those the cultural culinary crossroads, and we talk about the enslaved chef named Caesar that was in there. And then from there, we sort of take a tour through the downstairs part of the house, which is all the service areas. So it's the warming kitchen, it's the weaving room, it's all of these spaces where enslaved laborers would have been spending their entire lives. So before you even get to the top floor, you're already sort of introduced to not only the enslaved cooks, but the food, where it was coming from, and the entire sort of support system, for lack of a better phrase, of the Lees, right? Who was actually doing the work, the labor to make that house actually be as grand as it was and have the wealth that it had. So that's the main way that I've done it. But I've also been doing a series of foodways programs at Stratford, which I'm really proud of. And we got money from the Mars Wrigley Foundation, as well as Virginia Humanities. And we'll be doing another one on African-American food on December 12th, I think it is. And we'll have Dontavius and Cheney McKnight, who has Not Your Mama's History, and Nicole Moore. They're going to be coming out, and they're going to be doing Christmas time food, both for the slave quarter community as well as the big house. Thank you, Matt, for that question.
Here's another question. What was the book writing experience like? Do you have any future books in the works? If not, what topic might you focus on next if you decided to?
Okay, good question. So the book writing process was exhausting. I started out as my dissertation. So I don't think, normally books, if you don't go to grad school, are probably a very different experience writing them. But I spent several years, Yeah, it was several years. It was about 3 years total for the dissertation. So that was in the archive for a couple of years and then a year of writing. And it was, it was tedious. It was hard. I mean, one of the reviews of my book said that it was research light. And I wanted to strangle the person that said it, because when you read against the archive and when you're really looking for needles in haystacks, you research more than anybody else research, and you probably don't get but a sentence out of 75 archival resources. And, for those of us that do this kind of research, we know the pain. So it was tedious to get the information out. But once it started to render and once those voices came out of the archive, it was the most satisfying thing I've ever done in my life besides telling these stories. So the experience was gratifying. It was exhausting. It was a labor of love, for lack of a better word. And I have a few book projects right now in the works. One of them, I will just say right here, Dontavius and Nicole and Cheney and myself are working on a kitchen book. That's all I'm going to say. And I'm also helping out. I can't say too much, it's in my contract, but there was a Top Chef contestant, African-American chef, and I'm co-authoring I'm writing her historical part of a cookbook for her. So I'm very excited about that. It's definitely about African-American food. So that's going to be pretty cool. And I keep getting pulled back into the food stuff. I have other ideas, but it keeps pulling me back.
Did the enslaved cook also cook for the enslaved people? How did the menus differ for the family and guest, and meals for the enslaved people?
Excellent question. So again, the work that my book in particular, I focus on the cooks that were working in the big house. So they would not have been cooking all the food for the field quarters. So in a large plantation, you would have had anywhere from one to, my goodness, I can't even remember how many Monticello had, or even Montpelier, several field quarters throughout the plantation complex, like far away from the main house. So on a smaller plantation, that cook may be cooking for everybody. But these larger plantations, the enslaved cook and the staff would be cooking for the main house and all the white folks, and then the leftovers would sometimes be eaten by all the enslaved domestics. So the waiters, the footmen, the carriage people, the postilions, everyone working within that space would then eat at the very end of the night. And the meals would change. If you're working, if you were living in the field, you would have to, rations were given. So for instance, in Virginia, it was very common to get a little bit of fat pack and some cornmeal. Maybe if you were in Georgia or somewhere where rice was grown, you'd be getting rice as a grain instead. And then that's all you would get for a week. And so enslaved folks would have to labor, sun up to sundown for, every day but Sundays. And then in their quote free time, they would have to go hunting. They would set up traps. They would have to go fishing. They would have to supplement that food. And then in those spaces, people would share things, and they would say, okay, just like if you think about a pot of gumbo, right? One pot meal, Robert has some fish and Sally's got, some vegetables out of her side garden. Let's put it all together and make a meal. And so that was the one pot meal was a very West African tradition anyways. And so it was recreated out of necessity throughout the diaspora. And I think I answered your question.
Here's another one. Was it typical that there would be parties with the field slaves, the cooks from the plantation house, and the owners all in the kitchen area?
I would not say typical, but there were instances of it. So I think it was the Epps plantation. I think that was the Epps one. I kept finding references to these weddings and, things that were happening in there. And it was just a bizarre sort of space. Also, I've read some narratives of white folks talking about being kids going to hang out and play in the kitchen with the cook and, hang out with the enslaved children. And so it was a lively space in the sense of the cook had to be up late hours. So the lights were always on. And so people tended to sort of wander in there the same way they do now in kitchens. But, I would say big gatherings like that were very rare, but they did happen occasionally. There is evidence of that.
Here's a Montpelier specific question.
Uh-oh.
At Montpelier, the Madisons famously held very large outdoor dinner gatherings, with the cooks roasting whole pigs in the South Yard and serving attendant side dishes to many, many people. The complexity and difficulty of doing this seems unfathomable. Could you provide some insights about the enslaved cooks and how they managed the sheer logistics of such an endeavor?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So the barbecues and the fish fries, those things, when I read the evidence of those in the records, I couldn't believe how much work had to go in that. Because we're talking, the Madisons and other elite families, they would invite every elite person, within the region to come to their house to eat that whole pig and to, drink mint juleps and et cetera, et cetera. So when those things happened, a lot of times the neighboring plantations, if they were friends with the plantation family, would bring their enslaved cooks with them as well. And it would be an entire sort of posse of enslaved chefs and assistants working together to make the food. And there's, when I did read those instances of those fish fries and those barbecues, they had a collective group of people coming from other plantations to help make that food happen.
How would the enslaved cooks satisfy their owners with meals where the ingredients were hard to come by? Oysters in Central Virginia, for example.
Oh man, yeah, you weren't going to be getting a lot of oysters if you're living in Central Virginia. But the planters pretty much, the mistress knew what was available. They could order. Each one of these larger plantations had enslaved gardeners who were in charge of planting certain items for the different dinners they were going to have, etc. So, I don't think there was that crazy expectation. I know that when shipments came in and, you got a pineapple, that was a big deal. Celery was this like rare exotic vegetable back then, which I think is hilarious. They actually made celery like glasses, like vases to show off your celery in the dining room because it was so rare. I mean, it's just, silly things like that. So, they pretty much worked with what they had, and because these planters were wealthy, they were getting shipments from all over the world. They were getting cocoa from, the tropics and all different, sugar and all those kinds of things. So they figured it out.
Our archaeologists do find oyster shells at Montpelier, but they would have had to be really careful about how they.
Seriously. I mean, that, I can see that was probably a serious treat, forget a pineapple, get an oyster up there. It's a big deal.
Here's another one. Who did the shopping?
Great question. So enslaved cooks were often given permission and passes to go off the plantation. And that's something that was really exceptional for them. And you see in some of the runaway ads of people, they claim to be an enslaved cook. And it says, might be pretending to be a cook. Well, that means that identity as a cook gives you a little bit of a soft pass, right? With some people. So for instance, if you're living somewhere like in and around Williamsburg, you would go to the market once a week. You see that also happening throughout the Caribbean, Charleston, those kinds of places. If you're somewhere like Montpelier or even Stratford Hall, the carriage would come in with deliveries, and that's pretty much the ships, depending on where the water was. I mean, all of these plantations were growing something that was getting shipped out. So every time things went out, also objects came in. So not all of them relied on markets per se.
Here is just a comment. We toured Belle Grove last month, and our guide did what you just described. We started in the kitchen. It was very impactful that way. So Belle Grove is a National Trust site in the Shenandoah Valley, that's very cool. Another one from one of our colleagues. Let's see, where did it go? Sorry. Did cooks have any kind of special benefits or perks from their proximity?
Yeah, so I love that question because it goes back to that thing that I said in the beginning, tethering the pain of slavery to the romance of food. So they would have been eating better. They would have been afforded, nicer things in that space because they were part of the front stage. So a plantation complex is going to have enslaved folks in the field that are out of sight, out of mind. The ones that worked in and around the house were very much part of, sort of showing off the wealth of the planter family. And so, the housing would be better than you would be, if you were living, in the field, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them were allowed to live with their immediate family in the house, which is something that and you might not have, if you were a really good chef, maybe you wouldn't have your entire family traded away because you're sitting there and you can poison the person who just did that. So there were little bits like that, but you also think about having to live within that white landscape. You don't have any time when you don't think that the white family is looking at you. So you are constantly under watch, on call 24/7. Bell systems were set up. So, it's 3 a.m. and the carters roll up on their carriage because, they had a little bit of an accident somewhere outside of Richmond, and you have to get up and you have to make sure that they're fed. So, I think I think the benefits were slight, to say the least.
Well, that is, that's the last current question. And I will just take this opportunity to say thank you, Kelley. This has been incredible. And I would like to just let all of our audience know that we will be skipping the busy month of December, and our next virtual book club meeting will be on January the 14th, where we will have with us Tom Ricks with his new book, First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. And this book was reviewed on Tuesday in the New York Times, if you want to check it out. So, well, this has been incredibly wonderful. I look forward to coming to Stratford Hall for some of your foodway programs, and I know you've made an incredible difference there. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And to anyone who's on, if you would like a special tour of Stratford, I would love to give that, and our audio tour. I'm very proud of it. And we have an African-American tour that'll come out in February that we're also working on. So please come visit. Also, we have an exhibit that I'm curating that's going to be sort of soft opening here in the next month or so, but a nice big opening in March. And I can give you a little hint. Enslaved people have a very equal footing on the walls of the Lee ladies, and their artifacts are also equally spread throughout the exhibit space. So that's all I'm going to say, but it's a very exciting time to be at Stratford, and thank you all for zooming in.
Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.